At this point, I would like to acknowledge our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa International Programs and the University of Iowa's Honors Program. Both contribute vital time, talent, and logistics to our organization. I also want to thank the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization for their financial support, and also today's financial sponsors, Joyce and Dick Summerwell, and then Wally and me. Our programs are made possible by the financial support of all of these sponsors. And now I am very pleased to introduce my friend, Professor Christopher Roy. Chris is a professor of art history at the University of Iowa and the Elizabeth M. Stanley Faculty Fellow of African Art History. He is well known for his lifetime of work on the history and art of Africa, particularly Burkina Faso, where he was a Peace Corps volunteer, and where he has worked and done research for the past 45 years. Chris has also taught about the ancient art of Mexico, Native American art, and art of the Pacific Islands. For many years, Chris served as a curator of the African collection at the University of Iowa Art Museum, and he is currently teaching an online course on African art that has an enrollment of 300 undergraduates. And he just told me that throughout the year, he probably teaches about 700 students a year, which is, I think, amazing. Chris will also touch on the Ghanaian artist El Anatsui, who is one of Africa's leading artists and whose artwork is now hanging in the New Hampshire lobby. And we were very pleased to have that artwork here on campus. So will you please join with me in welcoming Professor Chris Roy.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm very happy to be here and to have a chance to speak with you and to share with you a little tiny insignificant country in West Africa that I've loved since 1970. And where I continue to do research. In fact, I just published another book on Burkina Faso last fall. A company in Milan named Five Continents published my book titled Mosi. So I've spent a lot of time doing research there. I've enjoyed every minute of it, even though where I work there's no electricity in the rural villages, so the daily temperature is about 120 degrees, and what you do is you put a wet towel over your head between 11 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon so your brains don't boil. I had a memorable experience it was 2007. Nora and I were coming back from Paris. I had been in Burkina, and we came through the Chicago airport and customs and immigration. We had marked down that we'd been in Burkina Faso and France. And believe it or not, the customs guy said, "Burkina Faso, I've never heard of it." And I said, well, I guess I made your day. I mean, if you can imagine a customs agent who has never heard of, granted, a small country, but nevertheless. So as you can see, this is the ICFRC lecture, September 2016. I'd like to talk about El Anatsui, then I'd like to talk about political issues in Burkina Faso, and then I'd like to talk briefly about the changes that I've seen in art in Burkina Faso over the past 50 years. Here is a new work of art. It's a tremendous coup d'etat, a tremendous coup d'art, because this is now hanging in Hampshire Auditorium right over the entryway where you walk on your way up to your seats. This is by a contemporary African artist named El Anatsui. The work of art is called Anonymous Creature, and he is one of the most prominent, best-known, most successful contemporary African artists in the world. We were able to get this object to hang, for one thing, because the study of African art has been an ancient tradition here at the University of Iowa. We awarded the very first PhD in African art history at the University of Iowa in 1957 to my teacher, Roy Sieber. I bet you all knew that, right? He then went to Indiana to teach, because somebody made the mistake of telling him he wouldn't get tenure here. where he became a distinguished professor and where I studied with him before I came here to meet the Stanleys in 1978. I had been interested in Africa since I was 18 years old. I was studying French language in Paris since 1966 when I was arrested by the French police and given 24 hours to get out of France. And so I hitchhiked from Paris to Jerusalem through Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan 1 year before Gaddafi. And I fell in love with Africa, and I fell in love with Black Africa. And so Nora and I went in the Peace Corps in Burkina Faso. It was then called Upper Volta. And I bet most of you remember it when you were in primary school or high school as Upper Volta or Haute Volta. But we'll see in a minute what happened. So because of our connection with Africa, the museum acquired this piece from the artist. He did a big exhibition that traveled all over America, including to that wonderful, absolutely first-rate international museum, the Des Moines Art Center, where, no, I'm not joking, it's one of the great museums in America. And Sean O'Hara saw it there and asked if he could buy it, and so Art on Campus bought this, and you'll see it when you go to Hampshire. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece. So we've had a piece by Anatsui for a while. This piece is made of wood, and like the textile anonymous creature, it's recycled. Anatsui has been doing recycled art for a long, long time, and this is a good example. But a previous curator bought this maybe 10 years ago, and it's been hanging in the museum. And now you see anonymous creature being hung at Hampshire by the special crew that came to mount it. And here you see what it looks like. Whoops, where'd it go? There we go. Here's what it looks like now hanging in place. So you'll recognize it when you pass under it.
Anatsui is one of the most important artists working today. Anatsui has been exhibiting consistently since 1976, so roughly 40 years. His work is important not just because it's African art. He's doing something very new. It's not painting, it's not sculpture, it's not just an object, it's an environment.
So there it is going up the stairs, and I hope you enjoy it. It's actually made of bottle caps. Anatsui's studio is right next to a distillery in Nigeria. He teaches at the University of Nsukka, which is in the Igbo part of Nigeria, and that distillery discards bottle caps by the thousands every day because somehow they're flawed. So he goes and his guys go and they pick them all up and flatten them out and weave them into the textile that you've seen, so that the textile made of metal bottle caps shimmers and moves. And in fact, Anatsui encourages every curator to hang each of the works of art they show different from the previous curator. So he gives curators, a lot of latitude in how they put them up. So that is one of our major achievements when it comes to African art in the last year here at the University of Iowa. Okay? So now I want to go to this country, which I have been in love with for 50 years. And as I said, it used to be called Upper Volta until 1983, when there was a military, actually a pretty bloody coup d'etat. And Thomas Sankara, who was a low-level officer in the military, took over and decided he didn't like the name, for good reason, because Haute Volta is from French and Volta is from Portuguese. Volta means, it's the Portuguese word for turn around, because the Volta River is where all of the early Portuguese explorers decided that if they went any farther, they would sail off the edge of the world. And so they decided it was time to turn around and go back to Lisbon. So he didn't like French and Portuguese for turnaround river, so he changed it to Burkina Faso, which means the land of nobles or aristocrats, and that's because of the Mosi people who live right at the center. There's Ouagadougou, which you can fly to from Paris on Air France. It's actually quite a delightful, modern, up-to-date African city that works very, very well. It's tidy, it's neat, electricity, running water, clean running water, everything you could want, and a little bit more. I just drew this map. Aren't I good? This shows the Mosi people who I studied who live there. So I wrote my dissertation on them, and then I've been studying all these other people ever since. And in fact, the young gentleman you saw in the movie, Corey Gunlock, who's now the curator, studies the Lobi people. He's one of my PhD students and just submitted the second of his 3 chapters for his dissertation. So what you can see is there's a lot of ethnic diversity in Burkina Faso, which actually has been a bit of a blessing, because what it means is that no one group of people really totally dominate the politics. Even the Mosi, even in spite of the fact that they're so populous, still have to make concessions to all of these other people if they're going to keep any kind of power. I've studied things like this. I study in rural farming villages far from the capital city. I love driving out at dawn through the cool air in my Peugeot station wagon and going to villages I've known for 50 years and sitting down with the elders who 50 years ago were young men like I was, and now they're all senior like you and me, and sitting with them and drinking millet beer and talking about their religious lives, about the spiritual life, and taking photos like this one of a mass performing. These are masks that represent spiritual beings or spiritual creatures. And still to this day, I find them very moving. They are wonderful to watch. They're incredibly lively and incredibly creative and innovative. As an elder now, having seen so many of the performances, I do exactly what all of the elders in the village do. I tend to sit and drink millet beer instead of getting too excited about the masks. But I still find them very, very exciting. There we go. And this is one in our collection. This is in our museum. It's actually from one of the villages where I've worked since 1980. We actually bought this at auction. It belonged to an art collector in New York City, and when it came up for auction in Paris, we purchased it in great part with the financial help of Dick and Mary Jo Stanley. This is another one from the same group of people, and if you're confused by these again represent spiritual beings. So they represent the same kinds of characters as the saints, the Hopi Kachinas, St. Catherine, St. Jude, St. Thomas, all of those different kinds of spiritual beings. But Africans, being the artistic geniuses that they are, choose to represent abstract ideas with abstract objects instead of making their spiritual beings look like saints, like St. Thomas Aquinas or somebody like that. Never mind, sorry. Here is a mass performing next to a shrine in a neighborhood in Uri where Nora and the children and I lived in 83, 84, and 85. And I've been going back there frequently in the past few years. This family, the Evo family, actually adopted me. And that's kind of an important idea, because what these people are doing increasingly, as you'll see, and I hope this is something you're interested in, is that they have been exchanging culture for development. So they invite people like you and me to go to their village, people from the embassies, to go to the village and see the mass perform. And the people are treated so warmly and hospitably and so graciously that the white folks from Ouagadougou get very interested in the village, and they want to go back. And they start to correspond with people in the village, even to exchange phone calls, because these people all have cell phones. And before you know it, white people in development organizations, in ORGs, in NGOs rather, I use the French acronym, start to do things like build maternities or schools or clinics or all sorts of other things that really benefit the village in important ways. So what's happening now is, with all of the changes that have taken place, the arrival of a lot of tourism has still benefited these communities through development by the guests who show up to see the mass perform. And that's certainly true in this town. I've always liked that photograph. That shows an older man who used to wear the mask dancing with his younger brother who is wearing the mask, and showing his younger brother how to perform. Notice the date. So this is the sacred hornbill mask. This is one of the 2 masks in the village that are the oldest in the village and always take a leadership role when the spirits appear in the community. You might be able to tell these folks are neither Muslim nor Christian. Like, what gave you a clue? In any event, the big development recently has been, in the past 20 years, a lot of communities in Burkina Faso have organized regional fairs, and they invite people to come from all over the country to participate and compete for prizes. And they invite tourists from all over the country, from the two big cities, Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, to come and watch. And the result is that those towns where these fairs are taking place become developed. So they get better schools and better hospitals. The drawback is that the performances, which 40 or 50 years ago were all sacred religious celebrations, now have become secularized and are put on for the sake of tourists. And so you find that often the people who organize them, or sometimes even the performers, are Muslims or, less commonly, Christians. And the result of that is that you see two very different contrasting kinds, and I would show you if the video was working properly. You see two very different contrasting kinds of performances. The performances in the villages that I'm used to go to are very lively, like the two that you did see, with a lot of participation by the people in the village who have a good time, who sing the praises of the masked performer, who go in when the performance is done and raise the performer's hands above his head, which is how you take a bow in Burkina Faso if you're not on a stage. In contrast, in the stage performances during these big tourist events or festivals, the performances are much more stilted, much more sterile. You often see in the audience all of the dignitaries have left their seats and gotten back in their air-conditioned Peugeots or Citroëns and driven back to Ouagadougou because they have an important meeting that evening or they want to go to a restaurant. And so the seats, the chairs for the dignitaries are empty. So without all of the videos, so those are performances. This is a mask of the kind that you would see in Burkina Faso. It's very abstract because it represents an abstract spirit. This is a typical market, except it's a photograph that I took 25 years ago. And this is a market where people come to exchange goods like extra millet, extra corn, extra peanuts, extra cotton, extra thermonuclear red pepper for whatever somebody else wants to trade. And these are very, very lively places to visit. They were then and they still are. This is what Ouagadougou looks like today. And as I said, it is a very, very nice town. Is there anybody in the room who's ever traveled in Africa or West Africa? So some of the cities you've been to may not have been terribly tidy. They may have been a little bit chaotic. But in fact, for various reasons, Ouagadougou is none of those things. It is very, very well organized and laid out with great infrastructure because of the efforts of the government over the past 30 years. So Burkina Faso, Upper Volta went along from independence in 1960 to 1983 with several changes of government because mostly civilian presidents were found to be a little bit corrupt or a lot corrupt. And finally, in 1983, there was a coup d'etat, and this man, Thomas Sankara, took over and started what he described as a revolution, and it was a revolution. He was very anti-colonialist, bless him, and he tried as best he could to cut off the neo-colonial ties to France especially. He resented the hegemony and power of the United States, so he did the best he could to poke a sharp stick in the eye of the French ambassador and French government and the American ambassador and the American government, even to the extent of getting a new flag, which is the flag you see on the table right here. The previous flag had been a very nice flag with red, black, and white stripes, which were the same colors that are used on all of the art in Burkina Faso. This is the current flag of Burkina Faso. Does anybody recognize it? Where have you seen it before? Didn't any of you serve in Vietnam?
It's a little like the NFL flag.
Does it look a little like that? And what flag is that? The Viet Cong. So he consciously chose to use a flag that was almost identical to that of the Viet Cong, which was an obvious insult to the French and Americans. And that probably wasn't a terribly good idea, but a lot of his other ideas were very good. He absolutely insisted that all government officials be at their desks and work from 9 to 5. He tried to end corruption as best he could, and he was quite successful. He was pretty brutal in a lot of the changes that he made, so there was a bit of bloodshed. But I think that most people, at least my friends, liberal people in Burkina Faso, look back on his period as an important and great period in the history of Burkina Faso. But one of his best friends was a man named Blaise Compaoré, who you see here. And in 1987, Blaise Compaoré walked into a meeting with a AK-47 and shot Sankara to death, murdered him in cold blood, murdered everybody else in the room, and they dragged their bodies out and buried them in a trash heap. Compaoré was the chief of state, the ruler of Burkina Faso, the king of Burkina Faso, from 1987 to 2016. In 2016, he decided he wanted another term as chief of state, and people in Burkina finally said enough is enough. This is a photo of the presidential palace that he had built, and as you have seen way too often, these structures are a little bit grandiose. This is an image of the military. This is actually the Presidential Guard carrying RPGs. What do you call those? Anyway, rocket grenades. And he had a tight grip on the military. And so when the people of Burkina Faso went out into the streets to protest his effort to get yet another term in office, they were, well, their protest wasn't terribly violent. Even though you see smoke in the background, there was relatively little a loss of blood until this fellow got involved, who was the head of the Presidential Guard, and he committed a number of atrocities, and finally both he and Compaoré fled to Ivory Coast, which is where they both are now. Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire is the next country south of Burkina Faso, closer to the coast. So through their own efforts, through their own demonstrations, these folks really were successful in overturning despotic, tyrannical government and returning Burkina Faso to a semblance of democracy under the man on the right, whose name is Michel Kafando, who is a Democrat. And he has made some very important changes recently, and things are looking up politically for Burkina Faso. At least they were looking up until January of this past year, when this SOB got involved. And he is one of 3 so-called martyrs for al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, who snuck into Ouagadougou in January of 2016 with RPGs and AK-47s and blew up my hotel. This is the Splendid Hotel, which is, news articles described it as a grand deluxe hotel, and it's anything but that, but it still is a pleasant place. And I was incensed when they blew it up. And they started out across the street at this restaurant called Cappuccino, which they didn't like because for these guys it represented everything evil about the West, all of those terrible things everybody despises, like cappuccino. And so they blew it up and killed about 6 people, shot them down. And thank goodness the folks in the hotel heard the noise across the street, so they shut the doors and all went and hid in closets where they were safe. The terrorists set the restaurant downstairs on fire and all the cars in front of the hotel on fire. And so in the end, the real tragedy for this is that it has upset tourism so much in Burkina Faso, just as it did 5 years ago in Mali when the same thing happened, that the whole tourist industry in Burkina Faso has almost collapsed. And the result is that probably 1/3 of the income of Burkina Faso, or at least a very substantial portion, has disappeared because people are just afraid to go there anymore. And that's really a tragedy because even though it's an impoverished country, it is one of the richest countries, I think, in West Africa in terms of culture. And it's a pity that people like you can't go there anymore and visit and see the wonderful things like these masks performing. This is actually a photo I took in 1984. These are very typical of the enormous plank masks that the Bois people in Burkina Faso make to represent spirits. These are about 18 inches to 2 feet wide and about 5 feet tall, and each mask is carved out of light wood like pine, but they still weigh 60 pounds. So, as you might imagine, the young men who wear them in performances all look like Iowa football players. Their neck size is always bigger than their hat size. And they're wonderful guys, really funny guys. So the graphic patterns you see on them are actually the laws of God. These are graphic patterns that represent rules and regulations by which people in the community must live and that they must follow if they're to receive God's blessing. And some of them refer to the path of the ancestors. The zigzag pattern that you see here represents the path of the ancestors, which they call the Yabasore, that people try to follow as best they can because their ancestors were successful. Their ancestors grew good farms and had healthy families and built nice villages and sent their kids to school. So if we do as much as we can, if we do what they did, we'll be successful too. You would think that this would lead to really kind of profound conservatism, but it doesn't, because in fact these people are quite open-minded and receptive to change. In spite of what I just told you, these are a group of people who are very quick to pick up on new ideas and make use of them for their own benefit. So when folks come by and explain to them that if they use fertilizer on their fields, their crops will grow better, these folks are very happy to try that. When somebody else comes by and says we can dig a deeper well by drilling it instead of digging it by hand, the Bois people are very happy to try that. So they try a lot of different things. So like any good liberal in any part of the world, they're open and receptive to change. Right? There was a guy named Charles Darwin, right? Didn't he say change or die? Wasn't that what his book, was that the title of his book, Change or Die? I think it was. Origin of Species, Change or Die. Okay, that's a political hit for today. Here is a mask that I collected in 1985 and brought back, and it's in our collection. And this represents a supernatural spirit of the spring. How are we doing, Karen?
It's okay, you've got 5 more minutes.
Oh, good. Here is one of my favorites. The black and white rectangles represent for these folks the importance of senior education, of lifelong learning. Yes, because these represent the difference between ignorance and knowledge. In our own culture, do we have symbols for knowledge, for brilliance, for ideas? What symbols do we use?
Light bulb.
A light bulb, excellent. Oh, you should take my class. And we think of ignorance as what? The dark curtain of ignorance fell over Europe in the Middle Ages or after the sack of Rome. How do you suppose that goes over with people who are black? Black, 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 deep black, profound black, purple black. Just the opposite. For those, the white rectangles represent the brand new just tan goat hides that every young man and woman sits on after initiation while they're watching the mass perform. And the black goat hides represent the dark, sooty black goat hides that every person your and my age sits on after years and years and years of life and learning. Because the goat hides, at the end of the sacred season, they're rolled up and put in the rafters of Mother's kitchen, where they are protected from insect damage by soot, by smoke. And every year they get darker and darker and darker. So after 20 years, 30 years, 40 years have passed, they're a rich, deep black, just like these people's complexions. And so in a reversal of our tradition, black represents wisdom and white represents commencement. Okay? What do we give students when they graduate? A sheepskin, exactly. Very good, another student. This is another kind of thing that they make. These are masks made of leaves and wild bird feathers. And these are the kind of art that only lasts for a day. These are put on the performer's body early in the morning at dawn. He performs with them all day long, and then in the evening he goes out the west side of the village with the setting sun, where the costume is very carefully cut off because they don't wear anything underneath the costume. So very carefully cut off with a sharp knife and burned. So the work of art only lasts for 12 hours, or in my photographs. And this is a detail. I took that photo in 1983. And here's another. And here are the same masks performing at one of these public festivals in Daegu. And you can see, okay, look at the background, look at the stands. All of the chairs are empty because all of the VIPs have already gotten back in their cars and driven back to Ouagadougou so they don't miss dinner. And you can see how sterile the environment is. It's not nearly as rich as what you see in a village. I'm not saying that's bad. I mean, any change is good. I'm a liberal, so I believe very much in change, just like Charles Darwin. But it really has changed the character of performances in these communities. Where are we? Okay, so that's also at a public tourist festival. And these are Dogon masks from another country, from Mali, which isn't that far away. And these are normally seen performing up in the grand high cliffs of the Bandigara Cliffs. And here are leaf masks. I just showed you a slide, 2 slides of them. Here they are at a public festival, taking it easy, relaxing, but the context is very different. These are night masks that perform in the city of Bobo Dioulasso only at night. These are antelope masks from a group of people from far up in the north called the Bobo. This is a mask dancing all by itself with nobody watching because the dignitaries have gone home. And let me move on. Oh, this is a Guru mask from Ivory Coast, and a buffalo mask, and a beautiful, I know I'm going too fast, but I want to get to the last. Okay, finally here from 1983, you see the front side of a mask, and you see the back side. And the back side is decorated with the figure of a spiritual being named Mammy Wata. And Mammy Wata is a spirit of water and prosperity and progress, and she comes from the coastal area of Nigeria. She was brought to Burkina Faso in 1983 by 3 young men who were forced to leave Nigeria, and they brought the cult, the following, the religion, I shouldn't use the word cult, of Mammy Wata. Nobody really knew what Mammy Wata looked like after she was invented, created, came to life, until an African merchant saw this postcard in a market in Ghana, and this was a postcard of a Fijian snake charmer in a circus in Hamburg, Germany. And he saw her with her snakes and her frizzy hair and her light complexion and said, that is Mammy Wata. Let's base Mammy Wata on that. So he sent the postcard to his friend in India, who printed 5,000 chromolithographs and sent them back, and this then became the invented image of Mammy Wata. So this is a good example of change, right? The theme here is change. People who are open and receptive to change, who are liberal. And here she is on the back of the mask. In a country 3,000 miles from the ocean, a country that is bone dry, where the average temperature, like I told you, is 120 at noon, she became, for probably 5 or 10 years, one of the principal spiritual beings of this village of Boni. I'm going to end here. I took these photos back and showed them to people in Boni, and nobody remembered them because 20 years later, these masks had all disappeared. They'd all been sold, not stolen, sold. So they're all in collections in Paris and New York now, but they have invented all sorts of new ideas that express their openness to change. And as your friend and mine, a guy I went to school with, Gaius Plinius Secundus, or Pliny the Elder, wrote in 79 A.D. You all, I know, took 4 years of Latin, right? Semper ex Africa aliquid novi. There's always something new out of Africa. And that's the only thing in 2,000 years, since 79 A.D., that hasn't changed about Africa. Thank you.
Well, we'll start out with this one, Chris. Does Burkina Faso have a brain drain problem?
Yes. The only good news is that a lot of my good friends who went to university, in the United States have stayed in Burkina Faso. So, but nevertheless, Burkina suffers from the same thing that countries all over the world do, which is their best and brightest go to graduate school in the United States and become teachers or physicians. Like I like to say, they become physicians or real doctors, And don't go back to Burkina Faso or to China, or I'm sorry for those of you who are physicians. Don't go back to the country they started from. But I think mostly the people I've known have been so committed to improving the quality of life in this wonderful country that a lot of them have returned and are doing very well at the University of Ouagadougou or administering healthcare in Burkina Faso. If you ever come across a charity that works in Burkina Faso, the chances are about 90% that it is legitimate and it does a good job.
Okay. Here are two questions on masks, and I'll just say them together. Do the masks belong to families, individuals, or villages? Who profits from their sale? And then the second question, is it just since the masking became secular that the people are willing to sell them? Were older masks in collections just appropriated?
Those are very good questions. First of all, they're owned by families. So in each village, there may be 3 or 4 families that own masks, and those families are free to sell the masks if and when they want to. Before the mask became secular, it was much more unusual for people to sell the masks. In remote rural villages, they never sold the masks, mostly because art dealers didn't show up to ask to buy them. But in villages like Boni, where I've done a lot of work right on the highway, they've been selling masks probably for 50 or 60 years. What was the second question? Oh.
Before it became secular, were they willing to sell?
So no, the answer is no. They weren't willing to sell. And so there's a little bit of scandal about some of the great scholars of African art back in the 1930s and 40s, like Marcel Griol, who was a French scholar and studied the Dogon. And he and some of his buddies during the colonial period were none too tender, none too polite about collecting objects. So a lot of the Dogon objects in the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris were collected by Marcel Griol, and he didn't pay for them. Okay, so they were typical rude colonialists. They appropriated them.
Are there any Christian groups who value the cultural and artistic heritage you have been describing?
No.
Maybe you ought to say why.
And I get in arguments with them. Actually, I've been known to be in the grocery store in Ouagadougou getting supplies to take out to the bush, out to the villages. And I'll see this very nice-looking white couple, your age, my age, and I'll say, what are you doing? And they say, we're missionaries. And I ask them where, having visited almost every community in Burkina Faso in the past 50 years. And so I've been known to get kind of rude and they say, what do I do? What do you do, Professor Roy? And I say, I spend most of my time explaining to people in the villages why they shouldn't let missionaries come into their towns. And this doesn't make a lot of friends. Some missionaries have done very good things. I will fully admit that. They've done fantastic things like set up maternities. Some of the biggest missions are Italian Catholic missions where they save women who are in danger of bleeding out in childbirth. Huge numbers of things. And a lot of missionaries go and they build schools and they help with remove cataracts, and bless them all. But missionaries who go because they want to save their souls for Jesus, I can't help them much.
Okay, where are the women and what are they doing?
The women are very much there. These belong to families, not to secret men's societies. And so if the videos had worked just a tiny bit better, you would have seen lots of women in the audience, because the women are all the mothers and sisters of the men who are performing and know very well who they are. And so when the man finishes performing, the women will come out and take his hands and raise them up over his head to praise the quality, the great quality of his performance, just to say congratulations, okay? This is not true in other cultures like the Mande cultures in Mali, for instance, where art generally is used by men's secret societies, but in Burkina Faso they're used by families, so women are very much present.
All right. Tell us more about the religious ceremonies. Do most of the people believe in the spirits performing, even in a major city?
Most of the people in major cities are either Muslim or Christian. But most people in Burkina Faso are given three names when they're born. They're given a Muslim name, like Amadou, so when they go to the market commerce is all Muslim, they use their Muslim name. When they go to register for schools, because the school is run by Christian missionaries, they use Jean-Baptiste. But when they, John the Baptist, or when they go to sacrifice on the shrines to their ancestors, they use their traditional ancient African name because that's the only name the ancestors will recognize. Don't get me wrong, and I tell my students in class this more than once every semester. There's a real contrast between the city and the rural farming areas. In the rural farming areas where I work, there are very few Muslims or Christians in most towns, and that's why I like working there, because there are so few Christians and Muslims, they still have art. In the cities, most people are either Muslim or Christian, and they're teachers, airline pilots, merchants, government administrators, physicians, doctors, all sorts of things like that. Okay, so there's a big difference. And even though Ouagadougou is a nice, tidy, clean, pleasant city, I like to get out of Ouagadougou as fast as I can, because it's only when I get out into the villages that I start to have fun. There is nothing more pleasant in the world than 5:30 in the afternoon sitting on a log in a West African village while the women are starting to prepare dinner and the men are splitting wood, to sit down on a log with 5 or 10 old guys that were 30 years old when I was 30 years old, smelling the smell of wood smoke and hearing the children playing and the pounding of pestles and the mortars, pounding up millet to make the meal, and relaxing as the sun goes down. It's one of the most pleasant experiences I've ever had, other than going to Hansher Auditorium.
Did the revolutionaries force Islam?
No. No, never. One of the reasons Burkina has fewer Christians and Muslims is because they've never believed in forcing religion on anybody. And so the number of people who are Christian or Muslim has not increased since the revolution. In fact, I would suspect that Sankara was an agnostic or atheist, just because, as we know from French history, being devoutly religious is anti-revolutionary, right? Right? So, no, I don't think so.
All right, this will be the last question, and very appropriately. Was there ever a lower Volta?
Absolutely, and it's called Ghana. Who knows where Ghana is? Who knows where Upper Volta is, or was? Okay, just the next country north. As you might suspect, the Volta River runs through both of them. The Volta River starts in Burkina Faso and flows straight south over Lake Volta. Now let me repeat. In 1483, a whole bunch of Portuguese sailors in the employ of Prince Henry the Navigator were sailing around the west coast of Africa in little Portuguese caravels, and they got off of the mouth of what is now called the Volta River, and they said to the captain, "No, we're not going any farther, because if we do, we're going to fall over the edge of the world and great dragons will eat us up. It's time to turn around." What is the Portuguese word for turn around?
Volta.
Revolta, okay? So it became known as Turnaround River, the Rio Volta, okay? And so actually they named Ghana first the Gold Coast, but then when Upper Volta got its independence in 1960, the French simply decided to give it the name Haute Volta, or Upper Volta, the headwaters of the Volta River, which was perfectly appropriate, except like Sankara, that's from French and Portuguese, and they didn't like that. So I encourage you all to go to Africa. If you've never been to Africa and want to know where to go, I will tell you that the most pleasant, congenial, charming, pleasant country, I've said that twice, is Ghana, because the language of Ghana is English, and if you speak French, more power to you. You should go to Burkina. But the culture of Ghana is delightful, the food is delightful, the music is delightful, the people are delightful, and Ghana is a great place. If you want to go see animals, go to East Africa. I had never seen any animals in Africa until 2 years ago when I went to the Republic of South Africa and Swaziland for 7 weeks. And I went to Swaziland and finally saw some elephants and bush buffalo. But so West Africa is not where you go much to see animals. It's where you go to enjoy wonderful, creative, hospitable people. All right? Just like you.
So this concludes our program, and on behalf of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, I want to give you a big thank you, Chris. That was a good talk. I also want to thank our sponsors once again, the University of Iowa International Programs, the University of Iowa Honors Program, the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization, and our special financial sponsors, Joyce and Dick Summerwell and Karen and Wally Chappell. Also, City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. So now comes the fun part. Chris, as a small token of our appreciation, we want to present with you, to you the coveted
I still have my last
ICFRC drawing. Now you've got 2.
Thank you.
Nora can have one now.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for joining us. We're adjourned.